What does it mean to be a cowboy? Well, I like to think of them fundamentally in the same way that Chip Schweiger does, as people who have indomitable try, a willingness to keep going when facing insurmountable obstacles, an attitude of never giving up even after experiencing failure upon failure. All of these being things that in fact describe our wrestling cowboy, Hangman Adam Page, who has consistently and often dealt with defeat after defeat at the best and worst of times, making for a cycle that has been dubbed the Hangman Page experience, where no matter what happens, victories, defeats, feuds, friendships, anything, inevitably, it will always lead back to suffering. Yes, in turn, that builds character. The best of them are built through tragedy and loss. But damn, Hangman has been through a lot of suffering since he lost the AEW World Championship in May of 2022. With that in mind, our tale should start with the first major suffering for our cowboy after that point, the inaugural Trios Championship Tournament. If you've followed AEW since the very beginning, you know how ingrained the Elite is to Hangman Page's AEW character. They've defined his entire being as friends and enemies to even a detriment at times the whole way. This, however, was no more felt than when Hangman Page won the AEW World Championship from former Elite stablemate Kenny Omega, with the Bucks, also members of the Elite, famously giving him the nod, thus their approval to hit his finisher, the Buckshot Lariat, to end the match. The Bucks were in Kenny's corner leading up. They had chosen their guy, but they were never going to stop their friend from fulfilling his dream. That gesture was a sign they still cared, but it didn't mean they'd go back to being friends again, really, because Hangman himself wasn't ready for that. He wasn't ready to open his heart again, to trust people again after the Bucks kicked him out of the Elite at his lowest. It's just, the Dark Order never really cared about that. Their friendship with Hangman, no matter how one-sided it was, no matter how forced it was at times, meant something to them. They cared unconditionally about the cowboy on his road to the World Championship. They celebrated in the ring when he won the title, and when he lost it, they were there by his side to pick him up again, inspiring Hangman to reject the Young Bucks when they asked him to be their third for this inaugural Trios Championship tournament, and instead choosing to side with people who stood by him the whole way unconditionally, the Dark Order. It should be made clear as well, he was only going to support them in the tournament when it started. But when 10 was announced injured after they won their first round match and Andrade El Idolo took out Evil Uno, he agreed to help Alex Reynolds and John Silver, who had nobody else to turn to, making it clear as it could possibly be what the finals were going to be. One, by just looking at the bracket, but two, because Kenny Omega, who hadn't been seen since losing his world title 9 months prior, made his return here to side with the Young Bucks as their third. The obvious then played out, and it was Kenny and the Bucks officially taking on Hangman, Reynolds, and Silver in the finals at All Out 2022 to decide it all. This was the first time that Kenny and Hangman would be in a ring together since the title match. It was the first time the Bucks would take on Hangman since giving him the nod. And most importantly of all, a time where the cowboy had a chance to do right by his friends in the biggest match of their careers up to that point. One thing that should be remembered in moments like that, however, is that the cycle never stops.
Cracks the jaw of Kenny Omega. Oh, Kenny, man. Oh, Jet. Oh, my God. He went down. 1, 2, 3.
Similar to how Hangman pushed away the Elite at one point, he did the same to the Dark Order following this mistake. Fair or unfair, he would only team with them one other time in the future in a losing effort to the Blackpool Combat Club. Hangman's self-destructive tendencies caused him to end up truly all alone for the first time in a very long time. This is not a part of the cycle in the kayfabe way I've been talking about it so far, but it deserves to be mentioned because it is important to the timeline. So, following the Trios tournament loss, Hangman would be involved in the Grand Slam Tournament of Champions. This was a bracket made up of past champions, TNT, AEW World, and World in general alike, to crown a new AEW champion after the title was vacated due to CM Punk's AEW suspension. And that right there is the most you'll be getting on that. As you saw before, though, when the graphic was up, Hangman would take on Bryan Danielson in the first round, their third one-on-one match. But the first, he would outright lose. This is a suffering in and of itself, but the reason why it's not the main one at hand is because Hangman would get another shot at the World Championship a month later, this time in a singles match versus the newly crowned champion Jon Moxley. He would earn this after winning, and forgive me, I'm gonna stare at the screen here for a second, the AEW World Title #1 Contendership Grand Slam Golden Ticket Battle Royal. The match with Moxley, however, started off very hot. It started off like something that would be very special, especially considering this was the pair's first ever one-on-one encounter. Accidents can happen at any time though. Hangman would be concussed here and the match would end due to referee stoppage. This not only sucked because concussions are an incredibly scary injury as is, but also because the match felt like a moment that could have led to Hangman building some momentum. It was just not to be though, as that was halted in an instant. Coming out of that world title challenge, Hangman would spend 3 months recovering from the injury and then go on to face Mox 3 more times. 2 singles matches, 1 win, 1 loss, and a Texas death match to settle the difference, which he won. Meaning Hangman had won a singles feud against Mox, no less. That was something to celebrate. However, this was only the beginning for those two. As in the following weeks, the Elite began to feud with the BCC, leading to an angle to close out an episode of Dynamite, where with their backs against the wall, Kenny and the Bucks were joined side by side by the Cowboy once again. Justified by the fact that Jon Moxley had poked his eye out with a screwdriver not long before, and of course by the fact that Hangman still cared for his friends. Or maybe he was just afraid to be alone for too long. Turns out though, they still cared for him too, as this moment became the official reformation of the Elite as they were originally known to AEW. The two groups would do battle in the following months in regular singles matches as well as the famed Anarchy in the Arena and Blood and Guts matches, with the Elite closing things out and the latter on top. They were back running things in AEW. It all felt right in spirit, but actually, this was a weird time for Hangman. It was great he was back with his friends, but it didn't go unnoticed that this was kind of a step down for a wrestler people had thought evolved to the point where he could stand on his own. He went from being that main character world champion to a background member of the Elite in an instant, a position he had come to know over the years oh so well. This point was outwardly recognized on Dynamite by one Swerve Strickland, who had been on a rise of his own while all this was going on, working his way up the card, always striving for more and more, while Hangman, as Swerve put it, was sitting in pre-shows on pay-per-views. After AEW built around him as the franchise player, he wasn't competing for world titles. He was on pre-shows. He hadn't gotten new gear in a year, new merch in almost that, and a new contract had him developing a noticeable dad bod. No singles matches on Dynamite, no promo time either, not even striving for the world title anymore. Swerve made it clear in one promo that he thought Hangman had gotten comfortable, that he was getting complacent in the spot that he felt if he had, as in Swerve Strickland, he would have already been the first Black AEW World Champion. He was calling the Cowboy out, and what could any fan of Hangman say other than, well, he's got a point. This led to a match at AEW Wrestle Dream 2023 in Seattle, Washington, where in front of his hometown crowd, Swerve took Hangman's spot. He bested him, he backed up everything he had said, and he did it to the cheers of the people. People that at one point backed the Cowboy with everything they had, no matter the opponent. Swerve had pointed out something real. They clearly took notice, and it was on the Cowboy to earn them back. After a crushing defeat in what was the biggest singles match he had had in 7 months. Following the loss, we saw a reinvigorated Cowboy. We saw the Cowboy that strove to lead AEW come back. It had been a long time, but that little slap of reality had clearly brought the fire out of him once again. So much so, he vowed to take his place at the top back. But this is where we started to see early signs of what was to come, as Hangman began obsessing over the mogul, something we saw clear as day in a Dynamite episode shortly after WrestleDream. We're in a TNT Championship #1 contendership match versus Bryan Danielson, the show's opening match. Swerve would attempt to use his manager, Prince Nana's famed crown, to get the win. Before he could do so, however, Hangman would snatch it out of his hands, causing Swerve to eat a Busaiku knee for the loss. Hangman had done a good thing, but really, if you were reading into it a little bit, it showed that he was watching Swerve. He was keeping a close eye on his new rival. The Cowboy was scheduled for a match later in the night against Jay White, however, and it was there where Swerve would get his get back in the form of Prince Nana, who caused a distraction that led to a quick roll-up loss for Hangman. He was, of course, heated with how it went down, but nothing would come of this on that show. The real shit would go down 2 weeks later, where after a successful defense of the ROH Trios Championships alongside the Bucks, Hangman stood in the ring while a video appeared on the screen. This video would show Swerve breaking into Hangman's home, tearing up his child's artwork, standing beside said child's crib, draping a Mogul Embassy shirt over them, all while threatening them as well as Hangman's entire family. This was never going to be something that Hangman could live with. Swerve had made this intensely personal now and continued to escalate things in the following weeks, where he just tormented the Hangman. Hangman would try to get at Swerve. He would try to at least beat him up. If there was nothing else, he was gonna put belt to ass. But it became clear that this was headed for one thing and one thing only. The one match that Hangman had become known for. The one match that this hatred-fueled feud deserved. The Texas Death. The match was then set for Full Gear 2023, and it was there where Swerve and Hangman would end up having one of the most brutal, bloody, and violent matches in AEW's history. Staples would end up in the cheek of Swerve Strickland with Hangman's child's artwork caught in the middle. Swerve's blood would be drunk in the middle of the ring by the Cowboy. Hangman's head would meet the business end of a cinder block. If you can think of it, there's a good chance that it happened in Inglewood, California that night. However, the match would eventually have to come to an end. One of these men would have to stay down for a full 10 count. And that man, despite not losing even one of these matches up to this point, would be Hangman Adam Page. After all he had been through, after having his child threatened in his own home, Hangman would be hung with a chain, choked out, left lifeless. You would think that would be the worst part of it all. No way it could get worse. But the worst part of it for Hangman was that Swerve's victory was hailed by the crowd. This man who had put this supposedly beloved character through hell and back was being cheered for it. That would drive anyone mad. Following that brutal encounter, Swerve would make his intentions very clear. He wanted that AEW World Championship. After all, it was his ultimate goal before Hangman Page, and he wasn't about to let that man stray him off course any longer. So in the middle of the ring on the AEW Dynamite Homecoming show, he would make his case for a title match against champion at the time Samoa Joe, before being interrupted by none other than Hangman, who did the same. On the one hand, Swerve had beaten Hangman multiple times over. He had firmly taken his spot. But on the other, Hangman had won plenty of matches of his own, was a former champion, and held a grudge with Samoa Joe and vowed to make him pay for it by defeating him for his world title. Truth be told, they both had valid arguments. It was difficult to decide who deserved it more. So they would each be allowed to pick each other's opponents for a week, and if they won both those matches, they would face each other. Hangman picked Rob Van Dam for Swerve, a hardcore match, no less, which Swerve won, and Swerve would pick Brian Cage for Hangman, a match he also won. Meaning we had finally arrived at the only true way to settle the dispute. Hangman versus Swerve 3. I want to make note, however, that throughout all this, between the Texas Death and this upcoming one-on-one, Hangman would make one thing very clear. He was going to prevent Swerve from winning the AEW World Championship at any cost. Not only because nobody cared more about the belt than he did, his words, but because a man that had done the things that Swerve didn't deserve it. The aforementioned third match between the two would take place on the February 7th, 2024 edition of Dynamite, and after 30 minutes of action, neither man could get the job done. Swerve would desperately ask for 5 more minutes though, which was denied by Hangman in an attempt to finally end his hopes of becoming world champion. His plan was immediately ruined mid-celebration, however, when Tony Khan declared them both #1 contender, and a 3-way match at the upcoming AEW Revolution pay-per-view for the world title was made. Hangman was furious. Swerve had not technically beat him like he said he would, but the cowboy had to put that anger to the side if he wanted to achieve his goal. He didn't exactly do that in the match, but he did put a different emotion to the side for the sake of his goal, his pride. Because at Revolution, Hangman would tap out to Samoa Joe while Swerve Strickland, handcuffed to the bottom rope, was left to helplessly watch on. He didn't do this because he was in too much pain though. He didn't do it because there was no way to escape, but because it meant he got to have his revenge. He got to prevent Swerve from becoming champion, since with that result, he would lose all the same. In this effort, however, Hangman would take out 2 AEW officials during the match, and on the following Dynamite, EVPs Matthew and Nicholas Jackson would indefinitely suspend him. So while he may have gotten what he wanted at Revolution, he was forced to sit at home and watch as Swerve Strickland did the exact thing he tried so desperately to prevent him from doing, defeating Samoa Joe at AEW Dynasty to become the new AEW World Champion. No matter the driving force behind the effort, Hangman would once again fail to achieve a goal he set for himself. He would once again suffer, only this time, it was all on him. Hangman would be off TV for the next 4 months before returning as the Elite's chosen wildcard in the 2024 Owen Hart Foundation tournament. This would come with new music, a new Tron, and a brand new attitude for the Cowboy. An attitude fueled by so much hatred and jealousy for a man whose name he couldn't even say, only ever calling Swerve him, his, and the like. In a promo after a brutal beatdown of his first round Owen opponent Jeff Jarrett, Hangman vowed to right a wrong that should have been righted a long time ago, to burn his world to the ground. In his way in the second round of the tournament though was Jay White, a man he had not beaten up to this point. A stat he would soon rectify, beating Switchblade with his belt, choking him out with it too, winning the match, despite involvement from Jeff Jarrett as Christian Cage came out to even the odds. Hangman's path to him was becoming clearer, but a longtime rival in Bryan Danielson stood in his way. This was the American Dragon's final year of full-time wrestling, giving him that extra motivation on top of the motivation that is main eventing All In for the World Championship. However, as Hangman put it, their record may be 1-1-1, but he was as driven as he had ever been right at that point. He was desperate to get back to Swerve. Justice delayed is justice denied, and Hangman was determined to get his justice at All In London. The Owen finals would take place in Calgary, and despite the resolve, despite the conviction he had shown before, Hangman Page would be beaten that night. Meaning once again, Hangman failed to get what he wanted. He failed to get that revenge he thought would save him. A fact that would eat away at him, consuming his very soul even more than it already had. The Owen finals loss was hitting Hangman harder than anything else could. He lost out on another chance to balance his mind, and it only left him falling further, leading him to join sides with the New Elite, which was the Bucks, Jack Perry, and Kazuchika Okada for Blood and Guts. He did this because it was the easiest and most convenient way to get his hands on Swerve again. He made it clear to his team as well that he was only in it for himself. He was only in it for revenge. Hangman and Swerve both entered as the final entrants for their respective teams. And as soon as Hanger saw Swerve, who entered the match last, he exited the cage, handcuffed him to it, and started to put belt to ass. Okay, so I was really trying hard not to interrupt this video, but I can't continue this segment without mentioning this little part. As you saw in that picture, Hangman was holding up the title belt to Swerve, and during that time, he was yelling at him, "You will never be champion." So this whole thing of him not ever wanting him to have that belt continues. And now this video will continue. This meant that he wasn't helping his team though, and when Matthew Jackson lost his nerve about it, he threatened to fire Hangman if he didn't get inside the cage at that very moment. The door then closed behind the Cowboy, and the match started with Swerve still on the outside, but it wasn't long until Prince Nana appeared with bolt cutters in hand to free the world champion. He then wreaked havoc on the Elite before finally, in the center of the two rings, coming to blows with the Cowboy. This was met with an uproar of the crowd in Nashville, and despite it not lasting very long, remains an impactful moment in their story. However, it's not as impactful as what happened in London shortly thereafter, wherein the main event of All In, Swerve Strickland defended his world championship against the Owen Hart tournament winner, Bryan Danielson. This was the match of Swerve's life. It was everything his career up to that point had been building to. It meant the most to him, making it the best possible place for Hangman to get involved, to try and cost Swerve that world title he thought he should have never had. It wasn't entirely due to what Hangman would do on that night, but Swerve did end up losing that match. He was no longer the world champion, but this just didn't do it for the Cowboy. Not because of anything else but Swerve himself, who dismissed the actions of Hangman at All In on the following Dynamite, instead looking upon him with pity. He put Hangman below him. He in an instant made Hangman believe that he had failed once again, thus his thirst for vengeance was still not quenched. So he decided that he needed a match between them once again. Just them, no interference, and Swerve agreed. A steel cage match was set for All Out, but before we could get there, Hangman needed to get revenge for the action he most toiled over. The action that he just couldn't ever forget. Swerve had broken into Hangman's home, so when it was announced that Swerve purchased his childhood home, the Cowboy thought something needed to be done. During a contract signing that same night of the announcement, a video played on the screen, just like it did way back when, that saw Hangman pouring gasoline all over Swerve's newly purchased childhood home, making it possible for him to light it ablaze. With this action, with this incredible visual of him burning the house down, he had officially burned his world to the ground. The match for All Out then became unsanctioned. There were now 0 restrictions on these men, 0 things holding them back from absolutely destroying one another. And that's exactly what they did. It was the match everyone thought it would be. Bloody, violent, and brutal. In some ways, more so than their original Texas Death. With the match only coming to a close after a steel chair headshot from Hangman to Swerve Strickland. The Cowboy officially enacted the revenge he had been striving for over a year at this point. But on the ramp afterwards, with his music playing, you saw no kind of peace within him. You saw no joy. Instead, bits of remorse coated his quivering lip. Fear in what he had done pierced directly through you from his eyes. The screams that left his throat as he knelt down on the ramp were guttural. They were raw. They were in no way triumphant. They rather described a man realizing in that moment that he was deeply troubled, unsure if anything could fix him. Coming out of what was Hangman's first pay-per-view main event since Double or Nothing 2022, where he lost his world title, it wouldn't be out of the question to think this was the beginning of a rise for the Cowboy. He had finally, on paper, dealt with the man tormenting his head. Thus, he could now finally, firmly cement his focus on the World Championship. That run would start with a couple wins on Dynamite against Jeff Jarrett and Juice Robinson before he would take on Jay White at WrestleDream 2024. A man that he had beaten through nefarious means in the Owen and brutalized outside of that. However, this time around, it was Jay who would get the better of him at every turn, finding reversals and counters to all of his moves before soundly defeating him. That meant another pay-per-view loss for Hanger, but they would surely run this back. He would get his win back. Come on, right? Well, no. In the rematch at Full Gear a month later, the exact same thing would happen. It was counter after counter the whole way until Jay eventually found a Blade Runner for the finish. 2 losses in a row on pay-per-view after the lights out steel cage match was brutal for Hangman. Him beating Swerve was supposed to be the turning point. It was supposed to be the thing that set him free, but it just didn't seem to be that way. So, in an effort to find his way, Hangman would get involved with the Death Riders. He would join the Babyface squad. They would battle the group for weeks until eventually the Cowboy would find himself in a 4-way at World's End 2024, where he, Orange Cassidy, Jay White, and champion Jon Moxley would battle for the AEW World title. Or rather, Mox's briefcase. Again though, Hangman would fall short and lose once more on pay-per-view. This wasn't just a Jay White thing anymore. It wasn't just a hiccup. This was who he was. Hangman Page had something blocking him from getting it done in these big moments. Throughout all of these losses on pay-per-view, Hangman was still wrestling on TV, where he continued to bring that same aggression that Swerve brought out of him against his opponents. He was brutalizing them, he was wrestling without care, and his former friend Christopher Daniels started to take notice. He pleaded with Hangman to let all of this hatred go in order for him to become the best version of himself. He offered to help him at World's End as his backup, as his mentor. Hangman wouldn't necessarily accept his help though, to no surprise, and so CD just wouldn't show up, which was something Hangman took issue with when the two got into a heated confrontation following Hangman's match against Orange Cassidy on Dynamite, where in said match, it should be noted, he was still taking his anger out on his opponents. CD had had enough of that though and tried to talk some sense into Hangman once again, but the two would end up scrapping. An intense scrap where the Fallen Angel busted himself open via headbutt. The next week, Hangman cut a promo where he doubled down on the person he had become. He hardened after what Swerve had done. He comforted himself by saying if anyone had gone through the things he had gone through, they'd end up the same way. And he had to stay this way in order to keep his family safe, in order to have any chance of becoming world champion once again. He understood what CD was trying to say, but he clearly wasn't going to listen, and soon decided that CD had made his bed, challenging the Fallen Angel to a Texas death match on AEW Maximum Carnage, where he promised he was going to lie him in the bed he made. A promise he undoubtedly kept, as he left Daniels bloodied, brutalized, and ultimately at his end, as Christopher Daniels would retire from professional wrestling afterwards. Hangman would clip the Angel's wings, CD's finisher, and add it to his moveset following the match. This was now, more than ever, a man completely gone. It would take a miracle to pull him out of this dark place he had built a home in. Out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls. The most massive characters are seared with scars. This is a quote from Khalil Gibran, a Lebanese-American writer and poet, and I feel it is incredibly fitting here, as I deem this point the turning point for Hangman Adam Page. He has suffered quite a lot, as I've been detailing this entire time, but throughout he has endured, and the one part of the cycle that isn't labeled is that there will always be hope. It could be short-lived, one major victory, or it could be the stretch we're about to cover, starting with the match versus MJF at Revolution 2025. You see, this match would come to be after a series of confrontations between the two following Hangman forcing CD into retirement. They would discuss what it meant to be a good guy, what it meant to be a bad guy, what it was like to gain and lose the crowd's admiration, and most of all, what it meant to be real. Both men claimed they were the real one, that they had earned everything they had gotten over the years. They were both in some way picked by the top brass in AEW, but that didn't mean they hadn't earned it again. So as things go, and as you've kind of noticed throughout this video, the only way to settle who was actually real was a match. Hangman would actually be the one to get the job done at Revolution 2025, picking up his first sanctioned singles win on pay-per-view since Revolution 2023, exactly 2 years prior. This stat was absolutely mind-blowing for many to realize, but the fact that it had been broken had to mean something. The fact that the people cheered him on during his match with MJF had to mean something. On the Dynamite following the pay-per-view, Hangman and MJF would interact once again, and MJF would claim that Hangman would always disappoint the fans. Max said Hangman wasn't even sure if he was deserving of their love. He claimed that he wasn't, and he said even if he were able to climb his way back to the top, to scratch and claw all the way to the pinnacle, he would come tumbling down once again, like he consistently had over the years. Hangman chose to challenge that idea with a simple, "We'll see," and soon after would seemingly attempt to make amends with Swerve Strickland by visiting his locker room. He wasn't there, so that wouldn't end up happening, but It was clear the Cowboy was going through some sort of change. A sort of change brought about by Christopher Daniels, by MJF, by this consistent streak of losing. Hangman seemed to finally realize some of his big issues holding him back. It was on the Dynamite Before Dynasty, where Swerve would be challenging Jon Moxley for the world title, where Hangman would find Swerve and the two would get into a shouting match, with the conclusion ultimately being Swerve admitting that he deserved everything that Hangman had done to him. He deserved getting his house burned down for what he had done. This was not only an incredibly impactful moment for their story, but incredibly impactful for Hangman himself. It didn't come across as something that would make him let their history go, but it was enough to cure his obsession. Hangman would actually get involved in that Dynasty main event as well, seemingly to help Swerve win the title, though he adamantly denies that. The Young Bucks would be the ones who would ultimately cost Swerve the match, and afterwards, they would claim they did it for Hangman. However, that hasn't been figured out yet, and so we shift gears to the 2025 Owen Hart Foundation tournament, where Hangman would attempt to do the exact thing he failed to do a year prior. Things would go well for him as he would defeat Josh Alexander in round 1, Kyle Fletcher in round 2, before ultimately finding himself up against Will Ospreay in the finals. The two would meet each other for the very first time on Dynamite, where Ospreay would force Hangman to confront the mistakes of his last year head on. Because while Hangman was trying to find himself, Ospreay was becoming the guy. He was doing all the things that Hangman used to do, taking photos with kids at meet and greets, signing autographs, doing media, doing interviews, the works. And while he supported Hangman finding himself again, he wasn't going to be beat and he wasn't going to get his spot taken. This finals wasn't about Hangman's redemption, it was about Ospreay's ascension. It quickly became the biggest singles match that AEW had put together for some time. And while many fans of Hangman, including myself, desperately wanted him to win, no doubt, we all know how the cycle goes. Suffering for the Cowboy was always inevitable, and we were left to cope with that. Or so we thought.
This is it, dude. This is gonna be it.
Hanger.
Buckshot!
That's it, bro. That's it.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
You know what?
My fucking Cowboy! That's fucking right! Cowboy!
After everything, after all the losses, after all the moments we thought would be his, but weren't, Hangman got it done. He beat Will Ospreay in the Double or Nothing 2025 main event in one of the best matches I have ever seen to win the Owen Hart Foundation tournament, earning him a shot at the AEW World Championship against Jon Moxley at All In Texas. Over the course of this video, we've detailed the constant suffering the character of Hangman Adam Page has gone through. We've detailed a man who, despite all the failure, turmoil, and heartbreak, never stopped getting back on that saddle. A man who was so deep in the dark that it was almost impossible to see him out find his way to the light again. A man who now rides into Texas with the people's spirit firmly on his side again. A man who has the chance to break a cycle that has defined his last 3 years. Hangman has lived the Cowboy way I described at the start of this video. He's kept with that indomitable try despite all the failure. But sometimes good things still don't happen. Sometimes these cycles we begin to notice just end up being unbreakable. At Texas, in Globe Life Field, at All In, we'll find out if the Hangman Page experience ends in suffering once again, or if the Cowboy is able to stand at the top of AEW, where he rightly belongs. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and before we get into anything else, I want to give a special shout out to my good friend 6 Star whose obsession with the cowboy helps so much when it comes to formatting and detailing this video. I want to also give love to Dropmick Wrestling, whose timeline of the Hangman and Swerve feud helped me remember every bit of detail I so desperately needed. Make sure to show love to the both of them on each of their respective platforms down in the description below. And thank you to each of them for their help in this video's creation. It almost wouldn't have been possible without you guys. Now, make sure to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed. Make sure to comment your thoughts on the Hangman Page experience down below. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel where we're always talking graps. I will be in Texas for All In Week. If you see me there, make sure to say what's up, because that would be sick as fuck in all honesty. I swear I will not mind at all. I will be slightly awkward as that is my nature, but again, I promise I won't mind. This video was a long time coming. I'm glad that I finally made it. I feel like now is the perfect time, and I'm sure following All In fact, I can guarantee there will be a follow-up to this video. But until then, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for the support. Stay safe, be well, and I'll see you next time. Hangman Adam Page, forever.